Yo, what is up guys, Face here and welcome back to another video. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day like always, and today I'm going to be going over mastering the skills of a heavy tank. I'm going to be going over tips that you can use to actually master a heavy tank, but what does it truly mean to be a heavy tank? Choosing the heavy tank class means that you need to understand that you will need to lead the team. When you play in a heavy tank, your teammates are relying on you. Your allies are absolutely working on how you decide to play the game. If you are doing the right things, your allies are going to be very happy because you're going to win a lot of games. As a heavy tank player, you have the duty and the task of pushing straight to the front line and playing that front line effectively, as well as holding the base capture so that your team can capture bases with the effective armor that the vehicle has. It can bounce shots and make sure that you get the bases captured. As well as holding a position as a heavy tank is way easier than holding it in a light tank. As everyone knows, you have no armor in a light tank, but in a heavy tank, you have all the armor, you have all the HP, so you need to use it effectively. We all know that playing in a heavy tank will give delightful emotions when you push on the enemy, and enemy shells fly off the armor without any damage to your vehicle. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, because to control a heavy tank in the game, there are tank destroyers with high penetration. This is because to control a heavy tank in the game, there are tank destroyers with high amounts of penetration that will not allow you to accelerate in the breakthrough or sit out in the open. So as a heavy tank, you need to be mindful of the tanks that actually have a lot of penetration and that will butter straight through your tank. That's why when playing in a heavy tank, it requires a certain amount of skill from the player. You need to have the knowledge of the routes in which you're going to take on the map, as well as you'll need to know how to take advantage of the enemy heavy tank's weak spots on their vehicles. You will also need to know the ability to tank in a heavy tank. To explain that better, you need to know how to take full advantage of what it means to be a heavy tank and tank all the shots from the enemy team. Make sure that you're taking the hits, bouncing the shots, and dealing the damage. First of all, let's go over the specifications for a heavy tank. There are many heavy tanks in the game, like we all know, and each of them have an individual gameplay or game style, which depends on the gun on the vehicle, the quality of its armor and mobility, and lastly, firepower. This is because in order to penetrate the most powerful frontal armor of other heavy tanks, your vehicle needs to have a good penetrating gun. When you think of free heavy tanks, you think of Germany, Japan, Russia, and Poland. All these nations have very, very good heavy tanks, and tanks that are basically super heavies. Obviously, you have the 60TP, you have the IS-7 and IS-4, you have the Type 71, and obviously you have the big boy Germans, which are the VK72, E100, and the Maus, the big boys. You also get rear-turreted heavy tanks. These heavy tanks will take advantage of side scraping a lot easier than a tank would if it had a forward-mounted turret. You also get tank classes which have very good alpha, which is the E100, or at lower tiers you get the KV2, which is a very high alpha heavy tank, as well as the KV1S. They might not have the most armor, however they have a very hard-hitting gun that can absolutely ruin players in one shot almost. There is also only 3 heavy tanks in the game that have a magazine system for loading their shells. At tier 10, it is the T57, the AMX-50B, and the Kranwagen. These 3 vehicles are the only vehicles at tier 10 that are heavy tanks that have that magazine where they can dump shots very easily and very sequentially and then reverse out of their situation and get out of the line. They don't really have the most amounts of armor, but they do have a lot of damage potential if they are able to dump their entire clip at once. Other than these 3 vehicles, every other heavy tank in the game are represented by a cycle reloading system with an average 1-time damage. This means that they only have 1 shot, they shoot, they get back, they reload, and then they shoot again. Now, I don't even need to say this. The German Maus is a truly movable fortress. When you see the Maus, you know it's time things are rumbling, man. It's an earthquake when that tank hits the party. And that is what you really want to do to your enemy. You want to, when play the Maus or those big, super heavy Germans, you want to get in the line, you want to push the enemy heavy tanks out of the way, kill some guys, take some shots, and that is how you want to play those big super heavies. You get other tanks like the Type 71 and T95E6, which are very mobile. However, they play different classes. So you get a heavium and you get a semi-heavium, more like a frontline heavy tank, which is the Type 71, and then the T95E6 or Stutzwagen K, which are both vehicles that are very, very mobile and don't have a lot of armor. However, they have a very good gun and a lot of gun depression, which allows them to work on ridge lines and deal with the medium flank very, very effectively. Now, why don't we go over the roles of a heavy tank? At the beginning of the battle, it is necessary to immediately determine the direction you need to take as that heavy tank and on that map, because in most cases, the heavy tank in the middle of the battle, there will not be an opportunity for you to change to a different flank because you're not mobile enough. You do not have enough mobility to make mistakes in the middle of the game, and really going to struggle if you decide only later on which flank you really need to take. Because on every single map at the first stage of the game, a heavy tank should know exactly where to go. Every map holds a position for a heavy tank and the best suited position for them. So it shouldn't really be a hard thing to go over, and I'll be going over in depth on how to make those decisions a lot easier. You'll always find that the team that is winning the flank is the team that has the most competent amount of heavy tanks that are subsequently pushing the flank towards the enemy base and are dominating and pushing back the enemy team. And that is what you need to do as a heavy tank. If you're not pushing the enemy team back, if you're not making them fall back into position and getting into cover, then you're not playing a heavy tank correctly. You have so much armor and hit points. You need to use that to push back your enemy and make them retreat. Keep pummeling them with shots. You need to make sure that with your hit points and armor, you are pushing the enemy team back and making them retreat. This allows them to fall back into position and lose that effective ground that they used to have, and this means that you can push them into a very dodgy situation where they cannot use their heavy tanks armor or their armor in general effectively. Like I said, heavy tanks bear a great responsibility on the battlefield. This is because the outcome of a battle will almost always predominantly depend on the coordination of your heavy tanks on your team. I'm going to go over a bit more what it means to be able to tank in a heavy tank. I know that sounds very weird. Some heavy tanks will ricochet the enemy off the front of their vehicle because they have a lot of armor in the front, and some other vehicles will ricochet a lot of enemies from the side of the vehicle. So not every heavy tank will have a lot of armor in the front, and not every heavy tank will have a lot of armor on the sides of the vehicle. So you need to take your tank class that you're playing and use it effectively and use it accordingly to how the tank can bounce its shells. Obviously, tanks like a mouse can bounce shots from every single angle, and obviously that will also take a certain amount of skill, but with the mouse, it's more of a just rush in type of heavy tank because you can bounce a lot of shells. However, if you're playing in an IS-4, yes, it has a lot of armor, but as soon as you show that lower plate, you're going to get pummeled, and people can just switch to heat shells or premium shells to just butter straight through the upper plate. So as a IS-4 or an IS-7, you want to use the side skirts of the vehicle to your advantage. You want to side scrape, you want to use that to your advantage to bounce as many shells as possible. As a heavy tank, you need to always be moving. You don't have a lot of maneuverability, but this allows you, if you are moving back and forth and side scraping and moving and angling, you're going to bounce the most amount of shells. So as a heavy tank, you don't want to just stop in the middle of nowhere and then just shoot and hope that you bounce shots, because that's just not how it works. As a heavy tank, you need to be angling, you need to be using that effective armor to its most amount of potential. And if you angle between 25 to 45 degrees on most heavy tanks, you're most likely going to bounce a lot of shots because your enemy team is now having to move their aim and accuracy towards where your weak points are now moving around, because you're moving around a lot. So as a heavy tank, only stop when you need to aim and shoot. And tanks have very inaccurate guns. That is going to happen, especially on heavy tanks. So tanks that don't have a lot of accuracy, you need to position your vehicle at the steepest amount of angle that you can that will work with that tank's armor, and use that to your advantage to put shots into the vehicle, into the enemy team. And then after you've put your shot in, you can start moving around and doing your angling that you need to do in order to bounce a shot while you reload for your next shell. I do want to note again, heavy tanks should always be in the front line. If you're a heavy tank and you're not in the front line, you're doing something wrong. You're not going to be sitting behind your allies in the back with a heavy tank. It's not going to work. Always, my three main skills that I have for you today, guys, is as a heavy tank, you should always be in the front line. You don't want to be behind your allies on your team. You're not using your tank effectively. If you're allowing your medium tanks and your lightly armored vehicles on your team to take the shots for you as a heavy tank, you're not doing the heavy tank job correctly. Another point, always look at the map early on in the game. As soon as you load in, look at the map. You know which map you're on. You've played it millions of times, but now you need to identify exactly where you're going to go to take full advantage of your type of heavy tank that you are playing. Another point, don't go far alone, because as a heavy tank, you don't have a lot of mobility. So if you go far up into the map alone without your heavy tank comrades, you're going to get caught out and you're going to get pummeled and punished for it, because as a heavy tank, you don't have the mobility to get out of there once you've made that mistake. Always want to be behind cover and using your tank effectively. Third and last point is you need to count on yourself first. You are the leader of your team and you must lead the team correctly. As a heavy tank, you have all the leadership that you should have when playing a tank like a heavy tank. You need to get into the position, take the shots for your team, and make the push yours. Dominate on your team as a heavy tank, as well as with your team, you're going to do very, very well in a heavy tank. So let me just quickly summarize this for you guys. As a heavy tank player, you need to always, and I say always, you need to always be in the front line, taking the hits for your team. Obviously, you don't want to get penetrated. You don't want shots to get through your armament and penetrate you, and you don't want to lose your hit points. So you need to effectively armor your vehicle so that you're going to bounce the most amounts of hit points from the enemy team and still put the shots into the enemy team's heavy tanks while you do that. So definitely, as a heavy tank, you need to be frontline. I don't want to see any heavy tank players from now on who have watched this video in the back of the map or hiding behind obstacles when their team is pushing. You need to be the person as a heavy tank player to start the push and end that same push. I want to note this one point again. You never want to push alone. If you see on the enemy team they have 4 heavy tanks and your team only has 2, you need to take more of a defensive position. If you are low on heavy tanks on your team, you don't want to push in. You don't want to be the people to dominate the push, because that is not going to happen with 2 versus 4 heavy tanks. So if you're in that situation, you need to get into a position where you can defend a position. You want to make sure that the enemy's heavy tanks have to push out to try and shoot you or to try and get to where you are. And this allows them to drive out in the open, show their weak spots, and it allows you to dominate them and put shells into them so that when you eventually need to push now, they are going to be on lower hit points than you. So always take that into consideration. Look at the enemy lineup. Take that into advantage to decide if you're going to be playing a defensive position. Reading the enemy lineup from the minute that you get into the game, it is going to allow you to make the decisions that you need to make early on to decide if you're going to be playing a defensive position on that map or you're going to play the rushing position. Because obviously, like I said, if the enemy team has less heavy tanks than you, you're obviously going to play the pushing up position. However, if the enemy team has more heavy tanks than you, you're most likely going to play the defensive position. Because a heavy tank, you always want to defend the flank. You want to stop the enemy's heavy tanks from rushing straight through to your spawn or through to your flank and then dominating your medium tank. So as a heavy tank, you need to always, and I say always, use your hit points and armor to your advantage so that your enemies cannot push through. One last key tip that I want to teach you guys is equipment. On heavy tanks, it's very important that you run the correct equipment. And on tanks like the Type 71, I have done a full review on it, so I'm not going to review the equipment thoroughly. However, as a heavy tank, you need to determine if your vehicle has good penetration or it has a good reload. On the Type 71, it doesn't have the greatest reload, so I use gun rammer. However, you must remember that as a heavy tank, you're going to be playing defensive positions a lot of the time. And if you're playing a defensive position, you want to reliably pen your enemies and make sure the shots are going straight through and they are doing damage. So if you run gun rammer, you may bounce your enemies, and obviously if you bounce them, they're going to take the advantage of when you're reloading to rush you, and you're going to get screwed. So always take advantage. Another key note, if you're going to play gun rammer, you can use your gun rammer to advantage to keep tracking your enemies' heavies, to keep them in place, and to keep doing damage to them. So reload is for that damage output to keep the enemy in their place and to keep them from pushing you. Calibrated shells is more to make sure that the shots are going straight through and clearing the enemies more reliably. Good note on heavy tanks is to run enhanced armor or improved assembly. If you're in a tank that has a lot of armor like a mouse or a super heavy IS-7, E100, mouse, VK72, all those tanks are super heavies. And for that reason, you're probably going to run enhanced armor because that 4% increase to the hull and turret of the tank are going to be a massive increase to the overall armor of the vehicle, which allows you to take a lot more hits and bounce them more reliably. However, if you're in a tank like maybe a heavium, like the T95E6 or Stridsvagn K, you can take more advantage from running the improved assembly because this allows you to increase your hit points. So when you're playing on the medium flanks like you should in a heavium, you can take a lot more shots. And because most medium tanks and light tanks have low amounts of alpha, that increase of 153 or 200 hit points is going to be a great increase to allowing you to survive a lot more, to do the damage and clear that medium flank. Another very, very good thing you can do is run enhanced tracks on a heavy tank, because this allows you to take a lot more hits to the track and allows your tracks to survive a lot more than they would without enhanced tracks. And it just allows you to make sure that the enemy team is not keeping you tracked and is not tracking you every single time, because in the game you only have 2 repair kits. So if you're reducing the chance of you having to use a repair kit, you're going to do very, very well. Anyways, guys, let me know what you guys think of my skills that I mentioned in today's video. Will it help you? I really want to know if this video helps you guys identify what you need to do as a heavy tank If you can let me know in the comment section below or in my Discord server, there'll be a link to join that in the description of this video. If you guys enjoyed this video, you can leave a like and subscribe. It really helps me out and I greatly appreciate it. Anyways, guys, that's it for me today. Hope your shots hit their marks and I'll check you in the next one. Cheers.